Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here, and today we are talking about the 14th of May 1536. We are one day away from the trial of Anne and George, and rumours are circulating wildly in Tudor England. So again, I wanted to talk to you about the injustice of this and really destroy those incest allegations. So the evidence being used that Anne and George Boleyn committed incest are that they sometimes danced together, kissed each other in greeting, and that sometimes George would be alone with Anne in her room. The twisting of this close sibling bond breaks my heart. It's utterly despicable. As a sister myself, it's perfectly normal to hug or kiss your relatives when you greet them. Dan and I have gone out dancing before. Dan has taken me out to a pub to go dancing. Often when I go to see Dan, I go up to his room and knock on the door, and if Dan says come in, I go and sit on the end of his bed while he plays music or sorts things out. We can talk up there for hours, and that is the sign of a close and loving sibling bond, as I'm sure that any of you guys watching this who have a sibling that you're close to, I'm sure you can relate to that and understand it. And this relationship is especially important to Anne in the time that she's living in, because she's in an unfriendly court with many people that she can't trust and who want her dead. But thank goodness that she has her brother, who is her close friend, that she can chat to and have a laugh with. Sometimes when we look back at historical people, we can think of the relationships between them being quite cold and quite different to the ones we have now. But that's something that draws me so strongly to Anne and George, because even though they are from the 16th century, you can see those aspects of the modern brother and sister relationship coming through. They like spending time together, they have a laugh together. They actually got in trouble at one point for apparently laughing at a book of ballads the king had written. Now the king took great offence at this because he's a very prideful man and he's used to courtiers telling him that whatever he does is brilliant. And I like to imagine the scene of him walking around with this book of ballads that he's written and Anne and George secretly cracking up over it. That's what siblings do. You laugh, you have in-jokes. Sometimes you just set each other off laughing and you can't help it. Henry thought that he was a fantastic and gifted poet, but remember that George is actually one of the most accomplished poets of the Tudor court, even though we don't have any of his works today to study. Anne was also highly intelligent. She was well educated and well read. It must have been amusing to them to see Henry, pompous Henry, strutting around with his poetry and trying to not laugh at that. Because I have such a close relationship with my own brother Dan, who you will probably know from this channel, he's an incredible actor and he's toured in Spain as Romeo in a production of Romeo and Juliet. You know, our bond is part of the reason that I'm still alive. You know, I love him to bits. So I'm always on the lookout in history for other sibling relationships that are so close and healthy and lovely. And it's so tragic that in finding one in George and Anne, you then see all those nice sibling things twisted into something so ugly and horrific. So there are quite a few interesting rumours flying around Tudor England. Now, one of them is that Anne was surrounded by a group of gay courtiers. So this rumour says that George Boleyn and Francis Weston, etc. were actually all gay men committing sodomy. It's quite interesting because Philippa Gregory, I think, uses this in her depiction of George in The Other Boleyn Girl, because she implies that he does have same-gender attraction in those books. But in reality, there is absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. And in fact, George Cavendish tells us that George Boleyn lusted after all women. George was certainly popular with women. He was attractive, charismatic and witty. And I can see the appeal as somebody LGBT myself of wanting to make a historical character into someone from the LGBT community. But I think in this instance, it is in slightly bad taste, because the very reason that these men were accused of that was that in those times, the Tudor times, they were highly religious, they were deeply homophobic, they would believe that sodomy was a sin, that being gay was a sin. So this was actually something that was put upon George and those men to try and ruin their reputations. Now, what's also funny about this rumour is that it completely destroys the idea, it contradicts the idea that Anne is actually having an affair with all of these men and that she's running like a sex cult and they're all competing for her. These rumours, these charges, they all contradict each other, and that just goes to show how no real scrutiny is being given to these accusations. This is not a fair trial. This is not people actually wanting to look into the situation and find out the truth. If this was going on today, then these charges would be laughed out of court. They wouldn't even get to court. Now, another strange rumour that's going around is that apparently George Boleyn was going around telling people that Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was not actually the king's child. And some of the rumours would use this to support the idea that actually George was the father of Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was the product of an incestuous relationship, Lannister style, like Game of Thrones. But if for 1 minute we decide to entertain the ludicrous notion that Anne and George were in this incestuous secret relationship somehow in front of everybody, and Elizabeth was George's child, why on earth would it be in George's interest to go telling people in the court about that? That is another fantastical rumour that just completely falls apart and contradicts itself. Now, what's interesting is that Eustace Chapuis, who is a big Catholic and he's an agent of Spain, so he goes and reports to Charles V of Spain. When George Boleyn was originally arrested, he couldn't understand why he was arrested, even though he couldn't stand Anne and he was part of, with Cromwell trying to bring her down, he couldn't understand why George was part of it. But now you see he's jumping on the bandwagon. So Chapuis spreads this idea. He says, Protestant bishops taught that when a husband proved impotent, according to their sect, it was allowable for a woman to ask for aid in other quarters, even among her own relatives. So Chapuis is now jumping in to smear the Protestants. He's seen a way to spin this to make Protestants look bad. Apparently, according to him, incest in order to have a child is now a Protestant belief. But remember what I said to you in a previous video, that at the time Anne is accused of committing incest with George, she's already pregnant, so she has no need of sleeping with anyone else. So on this day, Thomas Cromwell writes to a man called Bishop Gardiner. Bishop Gardiner is a reformer and he's a bishop. He's in France at this time. And Thomas Cromwell is writing to him to inform him of the situation unfolding in England. So I'm going to read you some extracts from his letter to Bishop Gardiner. The Queen's incontinent living was so rank and common that the ladies of her privy chamber could not conceal it. It came to the ears of some of the council, who told his majesty, although with great fear as the case enforced. Certain persons of the privy chamber and others of her side were examined, and the matter appeared so evident that, besides that crime, there brake out a certain conspiracy of the king's death, which extended so far that all we that had the examination of it quaked at the danger his grace was in, and on our knees gave him God Lord, and praised that he had preserved him so long from it. So Cromwell is now saying that the Queen was so openly living in this rank and terrible way that her ladies just couldn't keep it quiet anymore and they had to tell on her. He's now saying that there was a wide conspiracy to bring about the king's death, and it's such a relief that they've exposed it, because they were so sad that Henry was in danger. Again, as I've spoken about before, it would not be in Anne's interest for anything to happen to the king, because her protection would be gone. People at court hate her. He goes on to say, certain men were committed to the Tower, Marks and Norris and the Queen's brother. Then she herself was apprehended and committed to the same place. After her, Sir Francis Weston and William Brereton. Norris, Weston, Brereton and Mark are already condemned to death, having been arraigned at Westminster on Friday last. The Queen and her brother are to be arraigned tomorrow, and will undoubtedly go the same way. Undoubtedly go the same way. Cromwell knows that they're going to be found guilty. I mean, there's no way they can't be, because the other men have been found guilty of adultery. Who were they found guilty of having adultery with? The Queen. The Queen cannot then be innocent. He then says very vaguely, I write no particularities. The things be so abominable that I think the like was never heard. So apparently the charges are so bad that he can't possibly give any concrete details. Bishop Gardiner must simply believe him that these charges are real and they're terrible. Last of all, he says, Wallop will not be forgotten, though Cromwell cannot tell at present how much he is to have. The king is highly pleased with the services of both. So what he's saying here is that this is in the interests of him and in the interests of Bishop Gardiner. The fall of Anne and George will be very lucrative for them. Later, Bishop Gardiner is going to write to Thomas Cromwell and ask for more concrete details, which Thomas Cromwell again says, I'm afraid I can't give you, they're just too scandalous. So who are these ladies in waiting to Anne that have supposedly given evidence against her? Something that's quite common in fiction and actually supported by so many historians, which breaks my heart, is that Jane Boleyn is the cause of all this, and that Jane Boleyn brutally and selfishly betrayed her husband George and her sister-in-law Anne. Burnet tells us she carried many stories to the king, or some about him, and that she did this more out of envy and jealousy than out of love towards the king. So you can see how Philippa Gregory has used this description to build her terrible, awful character in The Other Boleyn Girl. Jane Boleyn in that really is quite a good villain, actually. Lacey Baldwin Smith, who is Catherine Howard's biographer. Catherine Howard is Henry VIII's fifth wife. She says about Jane, "The lady was a pathological meddler, with most of the instincts of a procuress who achieves a vicarious pleasure from arranging assignations." And C. Coote says, "The infamous Lady Rochford justly deserved her fate for the concern which she had in bringing Anne Boleyn as well as her own husband to the block." Now, I don't know why and when Jane Boleyn started to become history's scapegoat, as Claire Ridgway of the Anne Boleyn Files calls her, because there's no evidence that she did any of this. This is the monstering of a real woman based on nothing. I can understand making assumptions based on sources and documents, and I'm guilty of doing that, and all historians do. That is how you approach history and try and piece it together. You look at your sources, and then you try to construct a reasonable story around that to try and understand it and fill in the gaps. But as for Jane Boleyn, there's no evidence that people are using to construct this point of view. It just seems to be an idea that has been passed down and has just got out of control at this point. So at George's trial, which we look at tomorrow, he's going to frustratedly say that he is being condemned on the word of one woman. But this woman is never named as Jane, not in a single source. Now, of course, it could have been Jane, because Jane was one of the ladies in waiting, but isn't it more likely that if George is talking about his own wife, he won't refer to her as that one woman? Also, when Eustace Chapuis reports on this trial, he doesn't make any mention of this person being Jane, and you would have thought that somebody that's trying to paint the Boleyns in a bad light would have absolutely revelled in the idea of George's wife being so horrified by all this that she has to tell on them. Surely this would be ideal information for Anne's enemies if this was true. Quite a few historians actually think that the lady that gave evidence was a woman called Lady Worcester. John Hussey, who is a baron, and at the time he is the chief butler of England, he writes that "My Lady Worcester beareth the name to be the principal." So that means that of the ladies giving evidence, he says that she is the head of them, she's in charge. Lady Worcester is sister of one of the king's council, she is one of the Catholic faction. That would make the most logical sense to me. And also, when we think about these ladies giving evidence, we have to consider the situation they're in. Even though Anne and George have not yet gone to trial, it is pretty much known that they are dead. They are going to die imminently. What benefit is it to them to go down with the sinking ship? Anne and George are dead. Those other men are dead. These are women with lives ahead of them. This is going to influence how the king sees them and the favour he puts on their families. There are lots of reasons why women might have given evidence to Cromwell and his men. We just don't know because we don't have the documents. Now, in terms of the country as a whole and Anne's reputation, we're actually beginning to see an interesting shift, because Anne has been fairly unpopular because she is seen as the usurper, the woman who was below Catherine, who married the king and took her place, and Catherine was very loved by the people of England and did have quite a few supporters in the south of England. That's where I'm from. They were more Protestant down there, but on the whole, her reception as a queen and her public image was not great. She commented on the day of her coronation that as she was going through the streets on her litter, not many people took off their hats for her or shouted out to her. Yet despite this, people are starting to feel sorry for Anne and George. People who might not have liked her to begin with and supported Catherine are beginning to see what a dangerous and ruthless man Henry is. There's actually a growing of public support and pity for Anne at this time. Now, in a countdown by Claire Ridgway, she talks about the 14th of May and she mentions the rise of Jane Seymour. So up until this point, Henry has been trying to keep his interest in Jane Seymour a secret as much as he can. He doesn't want people to know that he's trying to get one wife executed because he's tired of her and he likes someone else. He knows that's going to make him look bad. But on this day, Henry sends Sir Nicholas Carew to fetch Jane, and he installs her in a new house at Chelsea, which is within a mile of where the king is staying. Chapuis describes her as being richly dressed and splendidly served by the king's cook and other officers. So although she's being kept out of the limelight right now, Jane is getting getting ready to be queen. This is Henry's first real public move that shows that he has another woman and he intends to put her in Anne's place. Okay, thanks for watching. I will see you tomorrow for the next video, and we're going to talk about the trial of Anne and George Boleyn, so it's going to be a difficult but interesting one. I love you loads. I hope you're staying safe, and I'll see you soon. Okay, love you. Bye.